A few years ago, I read through the book Licensed to Kill by Brian G. Hedges, and I'm doing a series of videos working through each of the chapters. Today we're looking at Chapter 2, Towards Life or Death. Hedges begins this chapter by looking at the story of Aron Ralston. You may have heard of him. He was featured in the news and also in the movie 127 Hours. This story recounts how Ralston went hiking one day without telling anyone where he was going. He stepped onto a large boulder which gave way, and as he fell off of the boulder ended up rolling onto his arm, pinning him, making him unable to move. And the story recounts how over the next 127 hours he attempted to free himself but was unsuccessful. Ultimately, he decided he had no choice but to break his arm below the wrist and then cut his arm off with a pocket knife. Survival experts on considering this story said, of course, it was foolish for him to go hiking by himself without telling anyone where he was going or when they could expect him back. But they all also agreed that Ralston made the right choice. By choosing to cut off his own arm, Ralston survived. Jesus tells a very similar story in Mark chapter 9, verses 42 through 48. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them if a large millstone were hung around their neck and they were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than with two hands to go into hell, where the fire never goes out. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 feet and be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where the worms that eat them do not die, and the fire is not quenched. Today, it may seem like only someone who is mentally imbalanced or an angry bigot would rail on about hell. But Jesus was neither. He realized that our sin situation is so drastic that it takes drastic measures in order to deal with it. Like a survival expert telling Ralston that he made the right choice to cut his arm off in order to survive, Jesus tells us we have to cut sin out of our lives if we want to live. That hiker didn't decide to cut his arm off until he realized that he had no other choice if he wanted to live. And neither you nor I will wage war against the sin in our hearts and in our lives unless we realize the negative impact that sin has on us, on others, and on God. According to Jesus, hell is worse than death. That's why he says, if anyone causes someone else to sin, to stumble, it would be better for that person to have died than to engage in that. Why? Because the consequence of causing someone else to sin is hell. Hell is way worse than death. And Jesus calls our attention to this because being his disciple is of the utmost importance. As Hedges puts it, hell awaits those who refuse Jesus' terms of discipleship. We need to be committed to cutting sin out of every area of our lives. If we only focus on behaviors, or if we only focus on those sins that are most obvious to others, sin will keep killing us. We have to be committed to avoiding sin, to practice social distancing from sin, so that we do not fall into temptation. I invite you to think about and reflect on Mark chapter 9, verses 42 through 48. Think about which sins you have tolerated in your life. Consider where you're giving sin an opportunity. Instead of practicing social distancing, you're actually flirting with and giving yourself into the temptation to sin. Commit now to cutting sin out of your life, taking a radical choice to follow God and pursue holiness.